This evening's focus will be on NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was founded in the late 1940s in direct response to a perceived Soviet military threat. It serves a secondary purpose, of course, of politically and socially uniting Western Europe and the United States against the Soviet Union. The program this evening will feature 4 distinguished representatives of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a representative from Germany, that is their deputy permanent representative to NATO. We will have a Vice Admiral from Portugal, formerly the commander of Iberland, which is a South Atlantic command of NATO. We'll also have the Dutch Security and Regional Affairs Specialist from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at The Hague, and a professor from a Greek university. NATO, of course, as I said, does serve primarily as a deterrent of a Soviet military assault in Europe. There are several issues which confront any alliance. Alliances, of course, are only as strong as the shared interests of its participants, and they're always subject to divergent interpretations of policy and subject to divergent interests. We can expect this evening to have questions raised, certainly about the adequacy of NATO, its ability to meet the Soviet threat, the kinds of military forces which are appropriate. We can also expect to have questions on the matters of the solidarity of the alliance, the matter of whether leadership should be shared, the question of whether the allies can unite in the face of a variety of problems, and certainly most important, the varied interpretations of the Soviet threat, the appropriate response to them, the questions of strategic forces in Europe, and then finally, of course, international order and the question of terrorism and how one deals with that. It's going to be, I think, a most interesting program. Our format this evening will be simple. A short introduction will be made by Mr. Voss, and then the floor will be open to questions. Mr. Voss will do us the courtesy of repeating the questions. We'll break at our normal time, 7:10. But because this is a panel, there may be a lot of questions. We'll then reopen the floor for questions after a minute or two opportunity for those who must leave at 7:10 to do so. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome our NATO Euro panel. John.
Do you have to push any buttons? It works. Mr. Burt, thank you very much for your kind words and your kind reception. I must say we're slightly taken aback. We have, with our panel, been in the Washington area for 3 days now, and we've met with various groups, and we have never faced an audience like this. That means we feel flattered on the one hand, we feel an extra responsibility on the other hand, and we feel slightly impressed on the third hand. Let me, in order to leave as much time as possible for a discussion, which we feel should be the main feature on our menu tonight, let me make a few short introductory remarks on what we came here for, and what we are, and what we would like to do and discuss with you. We are called the Eurogroup panel. The Eurogroup sounds very impressive, but what it actually is a rather loose grouping of the European nations within NATO, where we try to coordinate certain elements of our NATO policy, practical things. But one of the things we do in Eurogroup is try to get across an important message to our American friends. And that message is that Europe by no means is having, or would want to have, a free ride on defense. And if you would ask me to sum up in one sentence what this panel is coming to do here, it is try to get that message across. It certainly doesn't mean that we would not be prepared to discuss all kinds of other matters related to Atlantic security, if I may call it that. But let me make a few introductory remarks. Sometimes we have the feeling in Europe that in the United States, people tend to forget that NATO consists of 16 nations, of which 14 are European nations. And we detect sometimes doubts about European preparedness and willingness, motivation to make adequate efforts for our common defense. You won't be surprised that we, behind this table here, don't share that view, but we know that some people in the United States have that view and hold it, and we'd be glad to discuss it. There are, of course, completely legitimate differences in views, evaluations, judgments on international situations, defense matters, between the two sides of the Atlantic, and we should be able to discuss them. We have similar discussions in Europe amongst ourselves. And over the years in Europe we have developed a number of structures where these discussions take place. Just to mention a few, the Independent European Program Group, which deals with materiel matters, armaments cooperation. More recently, what is called the European Political Cooperation, part of the European Community, has really taken off. And it has come to a stage where really all the basic political matters in Europe are discussed in this European political cooperation. Now, as far as these discussions are on defense issues and security issues, let me emphasize one thing. When we discuss these matters amongst ourselves in Europe, we don't do that as a goal in itself. We do not organize defense activities as a goal in itself for Europe. But what we are trying to do is discuss these things to improve our input and our performance as members of the alliance. Now, the differences in perceptions and judgments on various defense and security related questions are partly a consequence of historic and geographical, political factors. But if we look at those differences in judgment between the United States and the Europeans, if I may lump them together, I think we should keep in mind that there are many, many more subjects where we do agree than where we don't agree. And fortunately, we have the type of alliance of free countries where we have the luxury to disagree and to discuss our differences, which cannot be said for every other alliance in the world. But the differences between, if I may say, us and you, are virtually always not a matter of principle, but a matter of different views on the way how to get somewhere. And I think very recently, and I'm bringing the subject up because otherwise you would, very recently we have seen a very good example of that, the Libyan affair. Let me say right now that we will be very much prepared to discuss this and to answer questions on Libya. Let me very modestly add that we would hope that we would not spend the whole evening on the Libyan affair. As members of this Eurogroup panel, we're delighted to be here with you in Baltimore, and we shall be very happy to take any question you have, which is only a little bit related to what we came to do here. I'm glad to give you the floor. The question is, for anybody who may not have understood, how can you have a working alliance with two countries like Turkey and Greece who have their enormous problems amongst themselves? It's all yours.
Well, let me first familiarize you with my accent. I hope it's not totally unfamiliar to you. I'm sure that you have some grocery shop somewhere in your neighborhood where you have heard this accent.
We are senators, sir. We have a senator.
I know that. I started from the grocery shop and I plan to move up. Well, the final answer to this question is that the alliance exists, and I'm here as a member of the Eurogroup to represent this alliance, which means that despite the differences, we do have an alliance, and Greece is a member of this alliance, as Turkey is a member of this alliance. And since I'm a member of the Eurogroup and I've come here to represent the common European defense interest and to stress the significance of ties between Europe and the United States, I would like to elaborate on this dispute. But if you insist in asking me about this dispute, then I might change my mind.
I wonder about how NATO comes to conclusions on how they should counteract the Russians when our Defense Intelligence Agency had one estimate on the Russian buildup between 1977 and 1983, and the Central Intelligence Agency came to the conclusion that the buildup didn't exist, it was flat. I wonder about your intelligence agencies, do you have this sort of discrepancy?
The question is, how can NATO plan adequately if the intelligence estimates on which we have to base ourselves are so different, and do we in Europe have other or more reliable intelligence estimates? I think we have an expert on real NATO affairs here.
I knew it would have to be me. But I think it is a very good question, and the answer to the question, without simplifying things, would be that the mere fact that we first had an intelligence estimate that gave a certain growth of the armed forces and the armaments industry in the Soviet Union, and a certain period later this estimate was corrected, is, I think, a good sign for the flexibility and for the trustworthiness of both the agency that you mentioned and the alliance as such. It would have been far easier for both, I suppose, the United States and the Allies to rest on the first estimate, because that was the underpinning of the ongoing efforts of all of us. A correction of that estimate, as I said, showed that we do want to be true to ourselves and with ourselves, and so I think this is a good thing. I think that the second estimate, without going into details, is impressive enough to justify the beginning of increased efforts on the part of the Allies with regard to their own joint defense efforts. Now, with regard to the second part of your question, do we have, that is to say, do Europeans have the proper means of intelligence which would lead us to our own estimation of the forces of the Warsaw Pact? I can say that some of us certainly do have means of national intelligence gathering, but that given the fact that much of intelligence gathering in these our days depends on technical means that also use space and technological means which are utilized in and from space, it is quite clear that a great part of the intelligence gathering activities will be done by those agencies that are equipped with such means. And most of our countries in Europe do not have such means. Thank you.
We all recognize the political, economic importance of the NATO alliance. Now, how does the NATO alliance view and fulfill its global responsibilities and in relation to international organizations like the United Nations and to the third world between which and the NATO alliance countries, the gap seems to be ever widening until it will stop. Probably will be 2 or 3 words. You know?
How does NATO view its responsibilities in a global sense, vis-à-vis, for instance, the third world? Isn't NATO concentrating too much on East-West only?
Well, sorry. If, for instance, you would, for just a second, consider NATO to be a rugby team, then you would expect their members and the team as such to concentrate on rugby and not on the affairs of the city or the state in which this rugby team is located. So I would have thought that an answer to your question lies in the very fact that the reason for NATO and the treaty that was which of means was NATO was founded has a very specified purpose, and this purpose is to make a joint effort to assure a common defense against a potential aggressor, which at the time of the inception of NATO and still today would come from the East. This is a task which is both military and political. Military in that sense that a joint defense effort will require a joint defense planning, and here we go into the military domain. Political, and that is perhaps at the time when we are not having a crisis or a conflict, is the more important aspect. Political is the task of NATO by constantly reviewing all problems and all questions that concern NATO and are relevant to the purpose for which NATO was founded. And I think that the governments, the 16 governments united in NATO, have to concentrate on that particular task as far as their membership in NATO is concerned. I think we would overburden NATO as an alliance if we were to ask NATO to pursue actively and formulate positively policy vis-à-vis the United Nations or the third world. But indirectly, there is, of course, let me rephrase that, but of course we do not live in a vacuum. And I have the feeling that this perhaps was the thrust of your question. I just said that the alliance as such does not have neither the task nor the means to be seized with problems of the United Nations or the third world. But the individual members of the alliance are, of course, very much aware of their obligations and their policies towards third world and United Nations. But the NATO as such does not have any such tasks, in my view.
Thank you, sir.
I think Professor Kostas would like to ask.
I would like just to add 2 words to what my colleague said. I understand your question as being that the essence of your question, that the Western Alliance, or if you want to put it in a different way, the industrialized, developed states of the world have a task to perform in the third world, because at the final analysis, sources of international conflict are social and economic sources, and therefore this is the problem that we should address, along, of course, with the problem of military defense. And in that sense, I think we should take into account the fact that all of the NATO countries, and I might be wrong even with one of them, and I'm not sure, but I'm sure about the rest, are members of the Organization of Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which has as a primary task the development of the third world, to coordinate policies of industrialized countries vis-à-vis the third world, and the fourth world, if you like, the most poor countries, those that is that do not have oil resources. And at the same time, 12 of the 16 members of NATO are members of the European Economic Community, which has a very strong and efficient, I believe, program in dealing with problems of the south of the hemisphere. And in that sense, I think there is an effort to coordinate the members of the alliance to the end that you mentioned.
Now, in NATO, we tend to make sometimes a mistake, which is that we're neglecting the flanks, and I would not want to do that tonight. So I'm going to move all the way out. The question is, what is the situation now? How should we look at various elements in the nuclear equation? Suggestions like non-first use, nuclear-free zones, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, and comprehensive test ban. These are all extremely important questions which merit some attention. And I think the best thing I could do is divide them up a little bit. SDI, Dix, would you say something about that? I could say something about the comprehensive test ban, nuclear-free zones. Any takers?
Okay. About the conventional power.
Conventional power for the
balance.
ATMO, which is also non-first use.
I'll fill the gaps,
Right.
if there are any.
Let me start on the comprehensive test ban. For a long time, there has been a situation whereby there are different views on the necessity of nuclear testing between many European countries and the Americans. I say many European countries because, of course, the French and the British have their own nuclear power, have their own nuclear forces, and therefore may look slightly differently at this problem than the other Europeans do. But generally, I think it is fair to say that in Europe, there is more sympathy for the idea of a comprehensive test ban, a complete stop of all nuclear testing, than in the United States. That situation has been the same for a long time. You know that we've had negotiations on a comprehensive test ban for a long time, also with the British taking part. Those negotiations have not led to concrete results. But the reason why the issue has come up again recently, and is an issue which I think is going to be with us in the years to come very much, is that the Soviet Union has picked up on this issue. Since Mr. Gorbachev has taken over power in the Soviet Union, we see that there is a much more clever, adroit use of public opinion than before. The basic goal of what is called wedge driving between the two sides of the Atlantic has always been there. But Mr. Gorbachev is extremely clever in doing it. And I think the whole problem of a comprehensive test ban is a very important example. The Soviets have, I think in a masterly fashion, picked up this issue. They could do that because they have in their, if I may call it, nuclear developments, more or less finished a series of tests which would allow them not to test for a certain period. They were very much aware that the United States was in the middle of a series of, or not in the middle, would have to make a series of tests, for instance for the development of Midgetman and some other weapon systems. They know full well that at least at this stage, a comprehensive test ban for the United States would not be acceptable. Now, given the fact that they know that the Europeans are basically interested in a comprehensive test ban, what better issue there is? And I said they've played it in a masterly fashion, because if you look what they have done, they have proposed not only proposed, but they've announced a unilateral moratorium on testing. When that moratorium expired, they have renewed it. When that moratorium expired, they have said, we are not making a new moratorium, but we will not start testing until the Americans do it. This basically means that you're selling the same horse 3 times. This is a very good example of this type of policies this Soviet government is pursuing, which does not eliminate the problem of a CTB. Many European nations feel that if we, one way or another, have to end what many people call the nuclear madness, a way to do it is basically to starve nuclear weapons by stopping the testing. You can argue about that, but it is certainly an idea which is strong in many European countries. If you have to start somewhere, why don't we start by making development of new systems impossible by stopping the testing? Now, there are 3 main reasons at this stage why the United States does not want to stop nuclear testing. By far the most important is what I mentioned, that there are a series of new nuclear systems on the drawing boards which need some testing. Another one is what is called reliability of the stockpile. Now, if you look at nuclear testing, you will see that it's only a very small percentage of tests that is actually needed for that purpose. The third element is, and then I come to my German friend, is SDI. Because as you know, in SDI, there is an element, and I very purposely call it an element because it is a minor thing in the total SDI conception. But the so-called pumped X-ray laser is an element where nuclear testing would be required. For these 3 reasons, the United States is not prepared at this moment to stop nuclear testing. It is an issue which we will have to discuss with you, which inevitably we will have to discuss with the Soviets, and it is an issue which will be with us, as I said, for the years to come. Which is this on about SDI?
Yes, if I remember correctly, sir, your question implied that a certain while after the foundation of NATO, NATO found itself in the situation where we had a superiority of manpower and a certain upper hand in the nuclear field. I do not think that I could share this, this perception, neither with regard to the conventional assessment nor with regard to the nuclear field. This by way of getting into the substance matter. I would like to try and limit myself, and I say this purposefully because on SDI we can talk a very long time. I would like to limit myself to 3 groups of considerations. The first group being the concept of SDI. The second group would be the attitude of the European allies. And the third group, the outlook and how the alliance as such, as opposed to individual allies, reacts to and thinks of SDI. Now, with regard to the concept, I think in a very simplified and perhaps oversimplifying matter, you can say that it is an attempt to make nuclear weapons obsolete. This is in contrast to the approach that Gorbachev has used in its various proposals, where he also where he suggests the total destruction of the presently existing nuclear arsenal. In my view, and not only in my view, but in the view of many analysts, the destruction of the existing nuclear stockpile will not solve the problem. Because anybody, simplified, will be able, after the destruction of the nuclear stockpile, to rebuild one weapon or several weapons, which is comparatively easy and can be done, if not in your backyard, but in our day and age with relative simple means. So the destruction, as I said, of nuclear of the nuclear arsenal would not rid the world of the nuclear threat. Therefore, the SDI concept, as emanating from the United States, aims at creating means which would make nuclear weapons unusable, that is to say, obsolete. Now, if this goal were to be achieved, it would no longer be very important whether there are nuclear weapons or not, because in the ideal and 100% successful realization of this concept, you could no longer use nuclear weapons because they would be obsolete, made obsolete by the SDI umbrella. This is the, as you all of you know, is the general approach, and we have the impression that the United States are firmly determined to further technological research into the possibilities of realization of this concept. Now, the reaction of European allies. First of all, I would like to say that the United States have informed the allies from the very beginning about this conceptual approach. It was the beginning of an informative and consultative process which was and is exemplary within NATO. Then you could ask, if that is so, why have the European allies not been more forthcoming in giving political or substantial support to this program? Well, I think you must realize that as alluring and as attractive this concept is of making nuclear weapons obsolete, the way from here to there is A, long, B, uncertain, and C, we do not know whether we get there. And along this long way from the initial concept to a possible realization 10, 15, 20 years from now, we will have to walk a path which is extremely dangerous, and I will come to that in just a second. In other words, and if you will forgive me for a very simple image, we had been asked, or we are in the position of a man who was asked to jump into a swimming pool, and when he asked, is there water in the pool, the answer was, well, you will see. And I think you can readily understand that with regard to a problem that is of vital, of crucial importance to the defense of the alliance, that it is evident that governments will show a certain hesitancy with regard to getting headlong into that same program. That does not mean, and I think we would want to underline this point, this does not mean that we are against it. But before one can get full support into that, you have to know what it is all about. Now, this being so, I come to my third consideration. You all know that the present defense strategy of the alliance is the strategy of deterrence. Deterrence meaning that any potential aggressor will not know in which form the alliance will react, and if so, at what given moment the alliance will take recourse to nuclear weapons. We call this the strategy of deterrence because we want to deter any potential aggressor from starting an attack. That is to say, right now at this moment, our defense strategy is essentially based on the existence of nuclear weapons and on the fact that the potential aggressor cannot calculate whether we will make use of them or not, and that will deter him. Now, SDI introduces a new element into this, potentially. Because if we are developing a system that makes nuclear weapons obsolete, we have to examine what consequences, what impact will this have on our presently valid strategy of nuclear deterrence. And that is why I said a moment ago, we are on a long and rather dangerous way. Because between now and the moment that we would have developed a new possible concept of defense, there will be long moments of uncertainty where both we ourselves are uncertain of where we are, and which is more important, if a potential aggressor will think that before we have evolved a new strategy, because we are uncertain of what we are doing, that he may find us in a weak moment where we are undecided. Therefore, I think you will readily realize the alliance as such is of course engaged in actively thinking about all this, but until such moment where SDI has come to take concrete forms, we will remain with our hitherto valid strategy, and we will not start a discussion on a possible new strategy under SDI aspects. Sorry, I was again too long, but...
Admiral, would you like to say something on the conventional
Yes,
side?
well, I agree with you when you say that the situation changed a lot since the nuclear umbrella till nowadays. Situation changed indeed, but not in our favor. In quantitative assets, the gap is larger between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. In a qualitative aspect, I think the gap is becoming narrow in the relation with the Soviet Union. We emphasize very much our superiority in qualitative assets, technology. But sometimes I think that when we do it, is because we realize that in quantitative we are very weak. For the other side, I have to remember you that the situation is also different between Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact and NATO, because they have not, the Soviet Union has not the problem of lines of communications. Lines of communication for us in the NATO is a vital flow through the ocean. We cannot afford to lose our lines of communications because they are like the blood in our body. The Soviet Union have not this large problem. Other aspects in conventional area, the Warsaw Pact is a centralized command and control. And this is very important in the first times of a conflict. Even in logistic field, Warsaw Pact have a standardization of weapon systems in every kind of equipment and interoperability of this equipment. We are going ahead in this aspect, but not so quick as we wish in NATO. So is to tell you that the conventional power is unbalanced, but not in our favor.
We realize these are long answers, but this was a very important question. I shall deal in very few sentences with the other two elements, which are also important. Nuclear-free, non-use of force declarations, non-first use declarations. In fact, my German colleague has already answered that question. We don't believe in non-first use declarations because an essential element of the NATO strategy is the element of keeping the other side uncertain on what we're going to do. If we are going to declare solemnly, and if we make such a declaration we want to stick to it, that we're not going to use nuclear weapons first, we are throwing away an important element of that uncertainty. So we're not going to do that. Nuclear-free zones. We don't think that is a solution of the problems, because they tend to create a false sense of security. You can create a strip which is nuclear-free, as has been suggested, maybe 150 kilometers or 300 or 600 kilometers. But you should not forget that most systems that would be relevant for that sort of strip are highly mobile. You could remove them from the zone and bring them back virtually overnight. Secondly, a nuclear-free zone can only be nuclear-free when also it is not targeted for nuclear weapons. So, in fact, it is not a concept we believe in, and we give preference to agreements which have a more global character, or, if you want, regional, if you talk about Europe, for instance. We'll go to the other flank. The unavoidable questions on Libya. Before the military action of the Reagan administration, the Americans urged the Europeans to take actions like expelling Libyan diplomats. Since the military action, things like that have happened. What are our conclusions from that? Would you like to take that?
Let me start by saying that the Libya question, in my view, is not a typical case of alliance coherence testing. Let me repeat it. I don't think we can test the coherence of the alliance from the Libyan example. And I'm sure that after a few days where the whole incident will have calmed down, this will be realized. There are much more important tests for the coherence of the alliance than the case of Libya. And for one reason, because is that technically the Libyan question is not a NATO question. NATO, as you know, operates under a treaty. I'm not trying to be legalistic to avoid the problem, but there is a legal aspect to that. Article 5 of the NATO treaty requires an attack from outside the alliance against a member of the alliance. The Greeks would like this to include attacks from inside the alliance, but this is a different story. At any case,
This is not for the record.
So technically, we should to take Libya as a case of attack against the United States. I think we are stretching the alliance beyond its proper limits. If, on the other hand, we do that and we insist that the Libyan question was a typical example of East-West conflict on which the alliance members should have reacted to assist the United States, no matter if it was a strictly speaking NATO obligation or not, then the answer, taking into account the result, would be that in this particular East-West relation, conflict, and without the assistance of the European alliance, the United States won. And won a decisive victory, if this is an East-West relation problem, even without the assistance of the European allies. In my view, though, and without playing with words, I don't think that this is a type of issue that we could include in the agenda as an East-West problem, or as a problem which technically members of NATO should have acted. And I have personal views as regards the extent to which the United States we would like to have NATO unanimities, so to speak, or NATO veto on out-of-area operations. This would mean that the decision of the United States to act in alliance with the European states outside Europe would depend on the veto of every single member of NATO. In other words, any act that the United States will have to take in defense of the global interest that it has as the superpower of the Western Alliance would depend on the veto of every single member who can say that, listen, this is not an issue that I consider to be an issue of East-West conflict. Therefore, I don't want to act on that. In my view, the system as it has worked so far in the issue of out-of-area operations, it has worked very well, and I'm sure that time is going to verify that. And let me add one thing, which has to do with the issue of terrorism, on which the Western European states were called to act. I think European states have done a lot of things during the last years to fight terrorism at home and certain measures to fight international terrorism, for which, remind you, they have paid a very high price. In my view, the United States administration gave to the European allies certain conflicting signals as regards the motives of the act it took against Libya. And what I mean by that is that within a very short period of time, we have two actions taken by the United States for two different causes. The first was the cause of the freedom of the seas. The American fleet was sent there to protect the freedom of American fleet to move in international waters. After 6 days, we have an attack, a bombing of Libya, of military installations, and unfortunately of some areas that were not, strictly speaking, military installations, and these were advertised, as you realize, very much in Western Europe, on the issue of international terrorism. And I believe that in this particular case, the Europeans were taken by surprise, first, because the first signal they got was completely different from the second, and third, because there had been absolutely no consultation prior to United States action in Libya, either in the first or in the second case. And this is why I believe that it's not a clear issue whether it is to the best interest of the United States to have a consultation mechanism, or even further to have a decision-making mechanism where states will take votes on how to act in out-of-area operations or out-of-Europe operations.
I would like to add one thing, that we regret a little bit that in certain circles the Libya thing is seen as a test of solidarity of the alliance. For the reasons my Greek colleague explained, it is not strictly an alliance matter. If you want to see a test of solidarity of the alliance, I think we could refer you to an extremely successful test, which is the deployment of medium-range missiles in Europe, where 5 countries, at enormous political expense, and I cannot overemphasize that, but in all the 5 countries, this was really a very hot political issue, where governments put their life on the line. It was very difficult, and all those 5 countries have stood the test and are well on their way to deployment. And I think that is a test of alliance solidarity.
I would like to say that with regard to the European attitude to the military action of the United States in that area, and as my Dutch, my Greek colleagues already said, it is not a question of solidarity or of loyalty to an ally, or whichever fashion you want to put it. But I think you would want to realize that here is a question of the judgment of the situation and of the analysis of what you would like to do in such a situation and of the conclusion that you do draw from such analysis. In other words, it appears that the European governments were of the opinion that terrorism, be it international or not, cannot successfully be fought by military action. And we also had the impression that the United States had come to a point where the United States thought it was intolerable, and I do have great sympathy for that United States citizens were victims of acts of terrorism in countries anywhere in the world. And from that anger and frustration that arose from that situation sprung the decision to have a military action. As I said, the European governments were not of the opinion that terrorism can be fought by military action. And looking at this particular military action, European governments thought that they did not see the political concept within which this military action was executed. So I think it would be very well to bear these considerations in mind before one starts to think ill of what one conceives as the illoyalty of people who are otherwise your friends.
The question is, in an earlier answer, the inference was that if SDI would be perfect, that the nuclear threat would be gone. But do we believe that there is no way of delivering nuclear weapons going around SDI?
Would you do that? No, it's okay. I think that this is a very legitimate question. But I think that you will realize that I can't answer that question. I cannot answer it because I do not yet know what if SDI succeeds, what it will look like. And only if I know the end result of these efforts will I know whether there will be other modes of delivering nuclear weapons. My guess is that such a mode might exist via the suitcase. So
Diplomatic pouch.
So that is, but that is something that is neither here nor there. What I think about that right now, because I don't know what the outcome of it is. But of course, your question, as I said, is legitimate, and it will have to be looked into at the proper time. But the time is not proper yet.
I would like to say something about. In my opinion, my personal opinion, there is a countermeasure for the SDI. Is saturation, and Soviet Union likes very much saturation, and at that moment I don't know if the saturation perhaps can do its role. I don't know.
I would like to add that the hypothesis that we could have an SDI which is 100% perfect, I don't think is really shared even by the scientists in the United States. What we are talking about in reality, and even there we don't know what the results of the research are going to be, is some form of mix of offensive and defensive systems. And the debate, the discussions on the viability of such a mix and the modes of such a mix will have to take place in the years to come, going along with the availability, the becoming available of the results of the research. But a 100% SDI, a 100% watertight SDI, I think is not something which anybody believes is real. The question is, if there would be a surprise attack tonight at 7:15 to be exact, 10 minutes, how would we assess to be the situation within NATO in 4 weeks?
I think I have to ask your pardon, sir, but I don't think that is a question that could in seriousness be answered. And I don't think I would do justice to your question if I were trying to develop a number of scenarios that could hypothetically be given in answer to your question. But a surprise attack at 7:15 tonight is something that must come out of science fiction. A surprise attack at such short notice is not possible in our world, because even if the Soviet Union were to decide now to start doing something, it would need to go into a certain sequence of technical preparations which could be detected. That already the hypothesis that tonight at 7:15 we have an attack which surprises us in such a fashion that we did not expect it or had nothing to do with it is not founded in the reality of the two blocks. And then we would have to want to know in which way you imagined this attack. Was it an all-out nuclear attack? Was it a conventional attack by the Warsaw Pact? So you see, all these are elements which would be needed to be put into your question to be able to enable us to give you a reasonable answer, but I don't think this would get us anywhere, sir, if you excuse me saying so.
Professor Costas?
Well, when I heard your question, my mind went to a movie that it was a great thing for in the United States and Europe. The name of the movie was The Day After, and it is a scenario that definitely wouldn't like to see played in reality. This would mean that we have to pay the cost for not seeing the scenario, and in my view, the best way to go about it is to strengthen our conventional forces and try to find a solution as regards the nuclear weapons. And the Greeks do pay a high price on conventional weapons. We spend something like 7.2% of our gross national income on defense. Unfortunately, we won't like to do that, but and we would like to continue doing so, but not for the reasons that we're doing in this present situation, if you understand what I mean.
The question basically boils down to, or the comment, to can you have a credible defense if the majority of your people think otherwise and feel that it should be done otherwise? That's another iffy question, because if there's one thing the INF debate showed, is that a majority of our peoples did support this. It took a long debate in all the countries. In some countries it was easier than in others, but the net result was that the majority of our peoples thought that this is the right thing to do. And I think that is the essence of a democracy. Let me emphasize that even if in some of our countries the population may be very divided over an issue like INF, and even if, let's say, the percentages for and against INF deployment might have been in some countries, I don't know, 60-40, 55-45, it has not, absolutely not, affected the adherence to NATO. In a country like Holland, where I think the opposition against the deployment was greatest, the percentage of people who believe that we should remain members of NATO is over 80%. And I think that gives us enough confidence to go along.
When two people confront each other, the belief that the other person will not do something is what keeps them off balance. And that's what I thought was inherent in what you were saying.
Well, then I have misstated my case. What I meant to say is that the other side, the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, are fully aware of our potential for reaction. They know up to the last detail what we have, I fear. But what they do not know is, in case of an aggression from their side, what of this potential we will use at what time and in what fashion. And that, I think, I would not want to call bluffing.
It was good to have you join the members of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs for this evening's session. A transcript of the program is available at a cost of $5. The Council is a private, non-profit, non-position-taking organization dedicated to foreign affairs education. Membership is open to the public, to all citizens seriously interested in foreign affairs. For membership information, merely call the Council at 727-2150 or write to Suite 2155 at the World Trade Center.